Good evening. This is Hope Preston, and welcome to the Washington County Master Gardeners monthly presentation series. Our speaker this week or this month is Darren Morgan, who is a native of the Willamette Valley, grew up on a farm, and he's the nursery manager at Shonnard's Nursery in Corvallis, where he's worked for 34 years. So I bet you know a lot. At least you should after 34 years. He also teaches workshops and community education classes for organizations throughout Western Oregon. And he generally has a focus on trees and shrubs, edible gardening, and most recently has taken up beekeeping. So I see future presentations, Darren.
Indeed, indeed.
This is our last presentation and meeting for the summer. We will regroup again in September because we can't afford to take 2 evenings out in July and August when we could be working in our gardens. So at this point, as Darren speaks, if you have questions or comments that you would like to make, please put them in the Q&A down at the bottom, and we will address all of those at the end of the presentation. So Darren, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you all for attending. Looks like a pretty good turnout this evening. I appreciate that. Today, we're going to talk about hydrangeas. So hydrangeas are kind of an old-fashioned group of shrubs, but they've enjoyed a real renaissance the last 25, maybe going on 30 years now. A lot of breeding has been done, and there's a resurgent interest in hydrangeas. So they're becoming a very hot item at the nursery, a very hot topic for talks. And so we're going to try to get a good overview tonight of what hydrangeas are out there, and what the differences amongst some of the hydrangeas are. And it's a really diverse group of woody and semi-woody plants with a lot of flower colors to be offered and a lot of sheer volume of attraction. Some of them will have some other benefits, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things about hydrangeas as a group is they are all summer blooming, and that's kind of a welcome change. You know, so much of our color here in the Pacific Northwest is really heavily focused in the spring with the spring blooming items, and hydrangeas are something that picks up and carries on through the summer, and in many cases even clear up into the fall, providing a much longer season of interest when there's not as much else happening. So the genus Hydrangea is just a huge group of plants, about 70 species, depending on how you want to slice and dice some of the technical botany. Most are native to Asia. There are several native to the Americas. Typically what you see in our area are Hydrangea macrophylla, and it's the big-leafed hydrangea, and its hybrids. Hydrangea serrata, the mountain hydrangea, and the interhybridization between the macros and the serratas. The panicle hydrangeas, Hydrangea paniculata, which are our sun lovers, and oak leaf hydrangeas, a good American native that is underutilized, in my opinion, for its sheer value in its landscape. There are also a few other species out there. We'll cover them at least in brief, particularly arborescens, which if you lived in a much colder climate, that's the hydrangeas you would mostly be growing, are the smooth hydrangeas. There are some climbers or vines in the group, particularly Hydrangea anomala or Hydrangea anomala petiolaris is a big, big vine. And we're going to very briefly touch on a couple of close cousins because I can't stop talking once you get me going on plants, and it's interesting to add a few more varieties into the mix. So, word about hydrangea flowers. When you're looking at hydrangea flowers, you're not looking at, per se, flowers. The actual fertile flowers are very small. These have the reproductive parts and the nectaries and the pollen production for the plant. They are typically well hidden behind the sterile florets, which are the showy parts. So in the wild, the original hydrangeas had some floret development to help attract the pollinators in to find the fertile flowers, but they were nowhere near so significant as a percentage of the flower mass. And then once people found them and started selectively breeding them for characteristics that they like, they kept getting bigger and bigger inflorescences, less and less sterile flora. Many of the modern hydrangea varieties are effectively don't have any real effective fertile flowers. This matters if you're into bees like I am or other pollinators, in that a lot of the very popular mophead hydrangeas really don't provide any pollinator benefit. What very few fertile flowers are there are typically very well concealed by the florets. That's not true of a lot of the other species of hydrangeas, and certain cultivars, even within the main group, do provide good pollinator habitat. And so what you're seeing here is what is called a lace cap hydrangea floret. So there are panicles. Panicles look like a lilac bloom, and so they're upright stacks of flowers. And almost all the panicle have pretty good fertile flowers inside. And then the mophead, which is what everybody's traditional view of a hydrangea is, often have very little. But the lace caps, as you can see, combine a really good showy sterile floret with a nice contrasting fertile flower in the middle that's very open for pollinators. So I've gotten more and more attached in recent years to the lace cap varieties for those reasons. So mopheads, again, the big ball shaped. The lace cap, sterile florets surrounding, and typically in a ring array, though not always a very tight ring or very demonstratively perfect ring, with the fertile flowers in the center. And panicles, even though you don't see a lot of the fertile flowers at first glance, typically the panicles are spread out enough and there's enough fertile flowers deep in the interior for pollinator access. So the classic hydrangeas are mostly Hydrangea macrophylla, some Hydrangea serrata, and again, the crosses between them. These are shrubs that traditionally would bloom on old wood. So if you were to whack them back to the ground in the fall, or if they were to freeze to the ground in the winter in cold climates, they might bloom very, very late into the summer and fall, or not at all, because they just don't have enough old wood developed to initiate flower budding. One of the big improvements in hydrangeas, and there's always been a tendency towards remontants or reblooming within the species, but the breeding in the last 20, 30 years has focused very heavily on enhancing that characteristic. So there's a lot of what they call reblooming hydrangeas out there now, and reblooming hydrangeas have the advantage not only of blooming for a much longer period of time, but also being able to bloom better in cold climates where they might take some winter damage, or in cool summer climates like at the Oregon coast, where they sometimes don't really get enough heat to develop out what good heads on old growth. This has been a real focus for breeding, but as in anything in economics, it's a caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Not all reblooming hydrangeas are equal. The degree of rebloom you get on them is often very heavily touted by the people who breed and sell these hydrangeas, but some are definitely more reblooming than others. Reblooming varieties can be either mophead or lace caps. And all of this group, Hydrangea macro, Hydrangea serrata, and their hybrids, show at least some tendency to change flower color based on soil chemistry. And what that is about is the changes in soil pH changes the ability of the plant to uptake or not uptake certain minerals, most notably aluminum. Typically, varieties that do change color at all will tend to get increasingly blue the more acidic the soil is, or increasingly pink the more alkali the soil is. That brings the question that I always get in the nurseries. Can I get a white hydrangea? Well, yes, there are some varieties that tend to be white and tend to hold white pretty well, with maybe slight tinging one way or the other. But other than that, it's really hard to keep a soil that has the right pH, the neutral enough pH to maintain white on varieties that are not very specifically bred to not change color with soil pH. So typically if you see white varieties, and we'll talk about a couple of them, they do not color change no matter what you do to their soil. And other varieties can be white, but only if the soil is relatively neutral. So we're going to get into some of the specific macrophylla and serrata varieties out there, and we'll talk more about the hybrids at the end. One large group of macrophyllas that has been increasingly popular in the last 10 years or so are the City Line series. The City Line series are very, very compact and reliable repeat bloomers. They were developed for front of the border applications or for use in containers. And there are, I think, 7 in the City Line series now. I put a couple of my personal favorites up on the screen here. Paris is a reliable pink that can tinge a little bit towards the purplish blues if you get it acidic enough, but tends to hold the pink fairly well. Rio is much more pH shiftable, and notice that in the picture there's some green undertone showing underneath the base of the inflorescence. That's true of a lot of this series, and you can see it gives them almost a bicolor effect, but not a real quite true bicolor effect. And it becomes increasingly pronounced as those individual flowers fade back towards their typically kind of a burgundy and green blend. Mars, on the other hand, is a full bicolor with the classic expression of bicolor flowers in hydrangea is a white or very pale ring around the base color. And the picture of Mars up here is my favorite way of seeing it in a very, very blue, but you can make it either blue with a white ring or pink with a white ring, and both forms color really well depending on what you do with the soil pH. So if you're got the blue one like that and you decide you really want to see it in pink, just lime it really heavily and it will tend to pink up quite readily. Couple of older varieties. Nico Blue has a special place in my heart. We had Nico Blue hydrangeas in the house I grew up in on the farm, and they're a massive, massive shrub. They're one of the biggest of the macrophytas, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. The flower balls are equally large, comparatively large. It's named Nico Blue, and in any real significant amount of acidity, it maintains a blue, but it is still pH variable depending on your soil. So if you lime them, you'll probably never get a really good pink, clear pink, but you might get magentas or some kind of off muddy purples if you throw too much lime at them. Glowing Embers is a compact but not dwarf variety, so it puts our size range at somewhere around 4 or 5 feet. Best picture I had on file for it, but honestly, it doesn't maybe do it justice. Glowing Embers tends to be pretty red pink to clear pink. Again, you can acidify it to muddy it a little bit, but it doesn't tend to veer into the blues at all. It really is in the pink and red tones. Glowing Embers seems to show maybe a little bit more sun tolerance than a lot of the other macrophytas too. Worth noting if you're trying to grow them at the edge of the conditions. Okay, here's a white for you. Wedding Gown is one of the best whites on the market that actually holds white in most soil pH conditions. As you can see, it is more or less a lace cap. It's not a very clear, distinct ring. One of the reasons it's not a very clear and distinct ring is because the flowers are quite double. There's several layers of the sterile floret packed together to make this kind of stacked temple-like protrusion, which is really stunning in show. And it looks great on the whites because it tends to cover over some of the inflorescence visually, so you do see a lot of the white. And next to it, we have Stargazer. This is a perennial favorite at the nursery. And again, it's a stacked double. So you see there's actually 3 rows of petals in each floret and a lace cap, plenty of fertile flowers in the center. But each of the petals has that white ring. And Stargazer is very variable with pH. So you can make it pink or you can make it purple or somewhere in between, depending on what you feed it. Both Wedding Gown and Stargazer are medium-sized varieties. We'd estimate them somewhere usually around 5 feet, though sometimes a little below. Now, hydrangeas don't have to be grown exclusively for the flowers. In fact, there are a number of varieties that were developed specifically for their leaf color. And the first 2 I'll hit here is our Light of Day and Lemon Wave. So both of those are lace caps, as you can see. Light of Day has a very minimal flower appearance. It's got a lot of fertile flowers and a very sparse set of florets. It is pH variable, pinks or blues, but never colors very deep in any direction. Light of Day is noted for its actually clear, pure white streaks and margins on all the leaves. And that effect is actually really quite stunning. It looks like a host on steroids almost in a shade environment. 5 feet of shrub with that distinctively white edged leaf. Lemon Wave has a little bit showier floret, even though they're still sparse. The individual florets are a little bit bigger. It's still a fertile flower center. Lemon wave, each leaf will be a little different color. The leaves will be irregularly streaked and marginated with varying shades of yellow, cream, or white. It's sometimes a little bit patchworky when you see all those different colors on it all, but in a dark environment, that really does pop out very well. On the other hand, the simple flower colors themselves can be so astonishing that you don't even want to see any leaf. Fire Island is part of a new series of hydrangeas, and they're typically noted for their wavy petals. And you see the fimbriation, the waves or irregularity to the petal, and a reverse variegate. They have white centers with a darker color around the edge. And as you can see, that is a really impressive visual array. Pistachio is an anomaly in the group. Initially, the flowers come out pretty much green. And over time, each floret changes at an irregular rate into varying patterns of reds and magentas creeping in. The anomaly in another way. As you notice in the close-up there, each of the sterile florets has a set of fertile flower in the middle. So this is one where the fertile flowers are not actually hidden behind the florets, but they're actually incorporated into the floret as it would be in a traditional flower, which makes them a good pollinator plant as well as a showy plant. Pistachio does take time for that color to develop, and we always get that first round of flowers in the late spring, early summer coming out, and customers that bought them say, "What is this you sold me? It was supposed to be all these bright, deep burgundies, magentas." It develops over time. It's a thing that happens as they age through, and that's not an uncommon trait in hydrangeas. A lot of hydrangeas go through color changes as they age. Pistachio is somewhat, but not heavily reblooming. Fire Island has had a pretty good rebloom for us. Okay, a couple of serratas for you. A lot of what you've seen at this point have been straight macrophyllus. Here's some straight serratas. Chirisan is a fully double, and again in that lace cap. The individual florets are not are dispersed, so the impact is quite big because the floret is really large. The inflorescence is really large. The individual inflorescences on that flower are very significantly large too. It is diffuse though, so sometimes hard to see the structure of each individual inflorescence on that shrub. Shirisan is around 6 feet ish. Bluebird is a more traditional lace cap array in a serrata, and both of these show some tendency to color vary with pH, but none of them color very well into the pinks. They tend definitely towards the blues and purples. Of course, some non-traditional forms are out there in macrophylla too. I love Perfection. There's a couple others, but Perfection is one of my favorites. So it is a mop head in a fully double, and it's so densely packed that it looks like a bright pink snowball bush. Very symmetrical, very large inflorescence, and intensely packed. Perfection will change slightly, but it tends very strongly towards the pinks. It's really easy to keep it a clean pink. Sweet Fantasy has the typical streaky variegation of virally variegated flowers. And so you can see that the varying degrees of almost cherry red against that pale pink inflorescence. That one does color change really well, and you can get purple with pale blue, or you can have cherry red with pale pink, and pick your colors depending on what you do with the soil. Another couple that have been grown heavily for their foliage interest, though the flowers are worthwhile in their own right. Miss Saori is actually an older variety. It's been around for a while. Leaves carry some purple, but they do tend to fade back towards kind of bronzy greens as the summer progresses. The inflorescence is a mop head style, and it is again a reverse pattern. So you've got the white interior and the bright exteriors. Does not tend to color change with pH. It's always pinks or reds. Eclipse is a much newer variety. So where Miss Saori has some purple but fades and tends to be around like 5-ish feet tall, maybe a little larger. Eclipse is incredibly compact, around 3.5 feet. The leaves come out purple and just get more purple as they go on. Now, the trade-off to that is to keep that purple color, you have to get them into a bit more sun. And so you have to be a little bit more careful on the watering. None of these carry the purples really, really well in very dark lighting conditions. Again, it's a reverse color variegate on the variegated flower, and again does not tend to color change with pH. It's always reds and pinks. And the other major species of hydrangea that has really, really hit heavily, and 30 years ago when I was getting in the industry, we hardly did any of these here. These, again, were a cold climate hydrangea, but they're definitely showy enough to have garnered attention. And with some of the improvements that have been made in the species with breeding over the last 20 or 30 years, they've really resurged in popularity here. Paniculate hydrangeas are very different from mophead and lace cap types. They thrive in full sun. In fact, they won't flower well if they're getting significant amounts of shade at all. Also, unlike the more traditional hydrangeas, they bloom on new growth. So pruning on these is like pruning a rose. You prune them back to a framework and fairly short, maybe not quite as hard as a rose, but the same basic concept. And then they push out lots and lots of new growth and put lots of large flowers if you treat them like that. If you don't prune them, if you prune them like a macrophylla, you'll get weak branches and much smaller flower production. All hydrangea paniculitis emerge white or greenish white in flower. But from there, as the summer progresses, those individual flowers age to a variety of colors. Some age towards pink, some to burgundies, and some towards a chartreuse green. Hydrangea paniculatas are extremely hardy. They don't have a lot of disease problems. They'll tolerate more drought. Drought tolerance is relative in hydrangea. None of them like really dry, but they're very much more forgiving of getting dried out than other hydrangeas. But they'll tolerate severe cold, Eastern Oregon, Midwest type conditions. So really good hydrangeas to add into the mix. So here's some hydrangea paniculatas. Limelight is noted for coming out kind of greenish white and just getting greener as it ages to eventually a fairly intense chartreuse. Limelight is a big and occasionally a little bit floppy variety, 6 or 7 feet in height, and a big enough inflorescence that sometimes the branches go a little bit this way instead of nice and upright. Little Lime was developed from Limelight, and it's a denser and less distinctively panicle-shaped panicle. You can see how squat it is. It starts looking almost more like a mop head, but the same basic coloration, so greenish coming out and aging to quite green, on a plant that's about 4 to 5 feet, so a little bit bigger than half the size of Limelight. That also gives it a stiffer flower presentation, less likely to keel over and display horizontally. Quickfire is a variety that is an open panicle hydrangea. So as you can see in the picture there, instead of that really dense cone, yes, they're still conically shaped, but they're disorganized and loose. But Quickfire's claim to fame is it blooms maybe 3 or even 4 weeks earlier than other paniculate hydrangeas. So it's the first one to bloom, it's the first one to color. And that can be a benefit because paniculatas typically start a bit later into the season, as you might expect, as blooming on new growth. There's also a compact off of Quickfire called Little Quickfire. It's a fairly new variety. So where Quickfire is, again, a 6 to 7 footer, Little Quickfire is about 4. Pinky Winky is very much, despite the name, is not a dwarf. Don't take that name as implying it's dinky as well. It's about 6 feet. It's a fairly good sized hydrangea. But it shows the characteristics that people have finally gotten behind in breeding these paniculatas. So flowers emerge with that dense cone of nice pure white. And then over the course of the summer, they from the base working their way to the tip, those white florets change to fairly intense cherry tones, reds to very deep pinks. It's a good picture there to show paniculate hydrangeas and their pollinator benefits as well. So you can see there's a lot of floret there, but as you get towards the top, you can see all those fertile flowers peeking out, and that provides good pollinator habitat. Strawberry Sundae tends to have less of a progressive change from white to pink. It'll be all white, and then in fairly short order, the whole floret will become, inflorescence will become fairly pink. Often not as red as Pinky Winky, but they can get pretty good colors on them. Strawberry Sundae is a compact, but again, not dwarf, usually something around 5-ish feet. I love Hydrangea Great Star. It's hard to find in the nurseries. It's hard to find in the nurseries because it's hard to make them look really good in a container. And even in the landscape, they have some problems. Again, it's kind of a looser panicle, but the individual inflorescences are so huge that the top gets very weighty. And again, it's not a really super rigid stemmed variety, so they tend to get a little bit floppy. They go through less of the color changes through the summer, though they will do some. They're really the show to them is these gigantic white stars in this panicle array. You won't see anything else that blooms like that outside of the tropics. Another significant different species of hydrangea are the oak-leafed hydrangeas, Hydrangea crucifolia. Neat thing about Hydrangea crucifolia is you can grow them in sun, you can grow them in shade. They're super adaptable. They do, however, bloom on old growth, and nobody has really developed a repeat blooming crucifolia. So you do have to be respectful in how you prune them to get good flower development. Like paniculate hydrangeas, they have that dense cone-shaped flower inflorescence. They always emerge white, and then they age down, and most of them age towards burgundies or sometimes burgundy and green blends, making them very showy as we get into the late summer and fall. Crucifolia hydrangeas, oak leaf hydrangeas, hold their leaves extremely late. They're not typically evergreen here, though I've seen them hold leaves a whole winter on a mild winter here. So those leaves, and they are large leaves and distinctively oak-shaped, they'll turn to kind of a bronzy or even a deep mahogany color in the fall, and they'll persist late, and finally usually drop off like late winter, like December, January, and be bare just for a very brief period before the new growth starts emerging. So occasionally, like I say, on mild winter, they will sometimes retain that foliage in that dark color, and then it will reflush out in green if that happens. So several varieties have been bred from these. Again, oak leaf hydrangeas are big shrubs. I mean, at the 6 to 7, that puts them a medium to large shrub by shrub standards. And so they've been breeding for a couple of characteristics. They've been breeding for things that have an interesting flower array, large cones, or good changeover in colors as the season progresses. But they've also been breeding for compact sizes. So Jetstream is a big one that they've been breeding to have a nice, dense, and full large panicle, and to consistently change over the course of the summer to a very nice, even tone of this kind of a burgundy red. Again, and you can see in the picture, although they're past their flower interest now, underneath those florets, you can see all those fertile flowers underneath. And the smaller bees, especially native bees, do a really good job of reaching those. So they are a good pollinator resource. The picture on the right is ruby slippers. So again, a good inflorescence and a good color changer, but on a compact bush, usually around 4 feet or so, making it manageable in the home landscape. We just don't have the size of home landscapes we did many years ago. So a lot of plants are being bred down in size. Of course, doubles occur in crucifolia too. I wish I had this good a picture myself. I had to borrow this. So that's snowflake. It is the most double oak leaf hydrangea you'll find. And this one's just at the end of its white cycle, and you notice that the older parts of the florets are greening. They will develop some burgundy under there over time, though they don't ever get as intensely burgundy as Jetstream or ruby slippers. So I mentioned at the outset that hydrangea arborescens, if you grew up in substantially colder climates, you have hydrangea paniculatas, they're pretty adaptable. But hydrangea arborescens was your mop head hydrangea. We're fortunate in the Pacific Northwest that that's not the only ones we can do. Typically, hydrangea arborescens blooms early, quite early, late spring to early summer. And the flowers are very large, sometimes to the point of excessive floppiness. As you can see in the picture there, that's an Annabelle, and it's cascading into the path because the heads are so big. So they do bloom on new growth, but they bloom early. And they often repeat bloom if you prune them back. So you get a flower in the late spring, early summer, and you might get a second bloom late summer on a good year if you do a good job of pruning them. And well worthwhile for that. They tend to be whites, but there are some color variants that have been developed. Most notable in the color variants, there's several pink varieties. Invincibelle was the first major pink one out there. And Invincibella had a lot of the problems that all the arborescens do, with the floppiness and particularly weak stems. They did Bella Anna is a much more recent adaptation of that old Invincible parentage, and it's got a very nice, very large pink flower on a slightly shorter, stockier plant with much more rigid stems. And that's definitely worth chasing down if you're interested in following arborescens. Arborescens are also, as I mentioned, good on the coast where the cooler temperatures don't always induce really great flowering on mop heads. An obscure one for you, you'll have to chase Hydrangea angustipetala. They call it golden crane because it's nominally a yellow. Well, it's kind of chartreuse at most. The fertile flowers are fairly chartreuse. The sterile florets are cream, not white. It is old wood blooming. Grower hybridizer says repeat blooms into the summer. My experience with them, not so much here anyway. But they are pleasantly and lightly fragrant, which is not necessarily typical of most hydrangeas. I love that open lace cap habit, and those inflorescences are quite large, and that serrated petal, which gives them a little bit more interest in the basically white. And again, they do not color change. This is always their color. Hydrangea aspera. Hairy hydrangeas. Leaves are relatively fuzzy, typically loose lace cap, and typically into the light mauve colors. These are not intense colored hydrangeas. That's why you don't see more hydrangea asperas around. But several of them have been bred for some specific characteristics, and Plum Passion was the first major one we saw in heavy trade. And it got some purple, but it never really got really purple, and it never really held that purple well. So Plum Passion Improved is a more stocky plant with better floral array. The flowers are presented better. And the purple color develops after the leaves come out quite well, and well worth considering as an alternative hydrangea. The big one, so hydrangea, I always laugh a little bit. Hydrangea arborescens, the smooth hydrangea we were talking about a moment ago, arborescens means tree-like, and it's really a stretch of the imagination to consider even the biggest of the arborescens as tree-like. They're definitely floppy bushes. Hydrangea aspera villosa, the late blooming hydrangea, is definitely tree-like in character. Very large, very rigid multi-trunk stems, can reach 10 or sometimes even 12 feet. Flowers are in that classic mauve that is typical of asperas, but are incredibly large. These are a batch that I took a picture of outside a nursery in Seattle last year. Leaves are very coarse, very fuzzy, and they're an ornamental characteristic in their own right, just for the sheer size of the leaves and display of them. Some hybrids. The most famous of the hybrids are Dr. Durr's Endless Summer series. So Dr. Michael Durr is the one who kind of really kickstarted this hydrangea craze in this country. And he spent a long time breeding macrophyllus and serratus and interbreeding them to get some specific characteristics with a heavy, intense focus on repeat bloom and managing the size. So the Endless Summer was the first heavily repeat blooming hydrangea on the marketplace. It is pH changeable. The flowers are not a nice perfect ball. They're a slightly amorphous mass, so they're definitely a mop head structure. And they have a lot of floret to them. So they do change colors completely with pH change. So you can make them pink or fairly blue. A good introduction, compact-ish plant, around 5 feet or so. Then they came out with Blushing Bride, and while it was marketed as a white, it really isn't white. It comes out fairly white if your pH is close to neutral, and it has a tendency to verge pink in most conditions. You're not going to get a blue one, but you can get them pinker than that. In practice, maintaining them white in our climate usually involves something like magnesium sulfate to try to keep the white on them. But letting them get just a tinge of pink does not detract from their beauty, in my opinion. Blushing Bride has a really good repeat bloom as well, and is a little bit less floppy in terms of its overall structure. The Endless Summer is beautiful, but it has definitely an amorphous bloom and an amorphous shrub structure. Twist and Shout, the first lace cap off of this group. And Twist and Shout is, again, fully pH variable, though it has a tendency towards blue in my experience. Much more compact, though not dwarf. We'll typically see around 4 or 5 feet. Excellent size, proportionally sized array with a very classic lace cap form. An excellent introduction. But they kept on going and going. Bloomstruck, introduced to be intentionally a purple. Yes, you can make them more blue. Yes, you can make them more pink, but their natural neutral tone is kind of this purple, this intermediate tone. And it's a purple that isn't too soft mauve. It's got enough presence to be pretty dramatic. Summer Crush is kind of the obverse of that, developed to be kind of a raspberry pink. You can get them more verging into the purple tones of pink, but it never blues up. It's always pinks or fairly magenta tones. Popstar was introduced to be the improved version of the lace cap Endless Summer. And it is much more compact at something around 3 feet, making an excellent container specimen. And I updated my pictures this evening before the talks, and so we have all the hydrangeas landing in the nursery right now. And so that's a picture of the Popstar at the nursery this afternoon. And so very typical of their presentation. Again, as they get a little more mature in the landscape, you'll find that the proportion of shrub to inflorescence does change a little bit, but it's still very dramatic. It's so heavily floriferous that it pretty much covers the whole bush with flowers. So besides the Serrata macro crosses that Dr. Durr worked with, a lot of other breeders are playing with hydrangeas, and they're breaking the mold a bit with what they're interbreeding. Variously marketed as Wow Time or as Princess Diana, is a cross between a macrophylla and a paniculata. So it has a roughly panicle shaped, though it's very often very irregular, as you can see in the top picture there. It can be fairly diffuse to call it a cone. They have the star-shaped inflorescence that is strappier, very much like a paniculata. They tend to pink. They do not tend to color change much. Leaf is intermediate, pointing towards paniculate habit, but bloom pattern is definitely macrophylla. They're an old wood bloomer with limited potential for repeat bloom. I know when they first hybridized them, they started introducing them, they were being touted as a significant rebloomer. Worked with them for several years now. I do not consider them a reliable repeat bloomer. Some of the newest hydrangeas we've run across in the nursery are the cascading hydrangeas, and I've never even been able to track down a definitive parentage. They're a complex multi-species crossing pattern. They tend to be lace caps. They tend to be white with very little ability to color change. What a color change does occur in them tends towards the pinks. And they are literally cascading, as you see in the picture. You put them in a container or a hanging basket, and they kind of trail over the side. We have seen Fairy Trail Bride currently in this country. That's a European introduction. I've got Princess Bride at the nursery. I'm still going back and forth through the resources and trying to determine if Princess Bride actually is anything different from Fairy Trail Bride. They're so similar, I cannot tell the difference between them personally, sitting even side by side in the nursery. So highly similar, if not genetically the same. There are supposed to be several others in this series, either available in Europe or coming out, but this is all we've seen so far. Okay, so the climbing hydrangeas, some variants in this. Climbing hydrangeas climb in the way that ivy climbs. They produce hair roots along the stem, and then they root into surfaces. This makes them a challenge on weak structures or on structurally sensitive structures. But it does give a very rigid climber that holds on really well. The common climbing hydrangea is Hydrangea anomala petiolaris, and it's a lace cap with a decent flower, though sometimes not as showy as you might hope. It's a very large hydrangea. We're talking 30 or 40 feet of vine is not at all uncommon. It will cover a whole wall of a building if you let it and encourage it. Two Asian species that are smaller climbers, both are evergreen, Hydrangea integrifolia and Hydrangea seemanni. Both of those are stockier climbers, usually around 20 or 30 feet in my experience with them. Typically, Taipang Shan is the integrifolia you see, and it's not really all that showy in flower, but the seemanni actually has a fairly decent inflorescence to it. Hydrangea anomala also, there are some interesting variegated varieties like Miranda, where the leaf color is its show, and there's a Hydrangea anomala petiolaris in flower. Really quite attractive in its peak. Peak does not last long, and it doesn't produce the volume of flowers of a macrophylla or a paniculata. A couple of cousins. Dichroa febrifugia is a woody, semi-woody shrub from China. The flowers are a pale blue at best. Listed as evergreen in its native habitat, definitely deciduous here, although they might keep some leaves on the coast. It is noted for being quite fertile in the sense that after the flowers, you typically do get some blue-black berries behind. More of an oddball collector's item for somebody who has to have everything in the family than a major landscape shrub. On the other hand, hydrangea vine, schizophragma, is a really attractive and, for my money, a better overall ornamental vine than the true climbing hydrangeas. Again, relatively large vines, 20 or 30 feet, with the lace cap type inflorescence. But notice that each of those florets is kind of a heart-shaped petal instead of a star or anything more complex. And that's kind of an intriguing feature to them. They typically flower white, as you see here. There are some pink flowered forms, although the pink is pretty pale. Again, many of them have been bred for leaf color like moonlight you see here. Okay, we covered some hydrangeas. I want to talk briefly about caring for your hydrangeas to get the most out of them. So all hydrangeas do not thrive on super sandy or super clayey soil. They like humusy soil. So do a good job of soil amending. Most, as we mentioned, really do prefer partial to moderate shade. Paniculata and Curcifolia are very happy in sun. Even the shade-loving varieties, it's really easy to think about them as a shade shrub, put them in really deep shade and suffer a lack of good flowering. They're that intermediate interface zone between sunny and shady spots, just like a rhodia or azalea. If you put them in too much shade, they just don't bloom well. Paniculata and Curcifolia, fully sun tolerant, very, very tough. Even on the sun lovers and the quote unquote drought tolerant paniculatas, consistency in summer water is important. Macrophylla in particular, the old-fashioned mop heads and lace caps are almost swamp plants. They really like a lot of summer water. Everybody else just needs consistency. Typically, we will feed late spring or early summer during their vegetative growth cycle with a rose or an all-purpose fertilizer. Moderate nitrogen, you really don't want to throw too much nitrogen. That tends to lead to kind of weak, floppy stems and lack of good flower development. For the types that do change color with soil pH, aluminum sulfate typically is used to make them blue. Lime will make them more pink, and magnesium sulfate will tend to keep whites relatively white. These shifts happen in degrees. We normally will try to put applications to change the color just about the time the buds start forming in the summer. And then if we're not bright enough or shifted enough as the first set of flowers open, we'll add some more, and you can change them through the course of the season until you get the tone dialed in you want. Bear in mind that soil chemistry changes aren't always durable, and they may change again next year and need some retweaking. So many hydrangeas bloom exclusively on old wood, and so you prune them in the summer after flowering. So this is Hydrangea macrophylla and Hydrangea serrata in particular, except heavy reblooming forms. Also oak leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea curcifolia has that problem. A lot of the interspecific hybrids, like the fairy trails and like the Princess Diana wow time, show this same pattern. So prune them at the end of their flower cycle lightly, and do not prune too heavily. You want to get a good stem development and flower bud for next year. Climbing types are seldom pruned, but if needed, they're pruned like this as well. On the other hand, hydrangeas, the arborescens and the paniculatas bloom on the new growth, and so we do prune them more like a rose. You want to develop a really strong, rigid stem structure to support that flower weight. So selectively thin the weakest branches out, opening the center, nice basing shape, and then prune them back. Arborescens, you might go back in that 2 to 3 foot range. Typically paniculatas, I try to go about 3 feet on the taller varieties anyway, to make sure I'm not butchering them too hard. In theory, if you go a lot harder, you get bigger flowers, just like with a rose, but sometimes at the expense of stem rigidity. The Endless Summer and other significantly reblooming series can be hard pruned like this if needed for damage control or in colder climates where they freeze back. So here's some hydrangea use in the landscape. Paniculatas are often developed, sold as patio trees, where you've got a large tree, single tree trunk form, and then the stems coming out from there, making this big lollipop. They're incredibly showy that way. They far beat tree roses, in my opinion. Unlike tree roses, they're not grafted. This is a parent root system. The stem has been trained up, and then it's allowed to branch it there. So they're less likely to have problems with graft failure or freeze out of the graft, that kind of thing. A lot of the oak leaves are incredibly structurally showy with that, as you can see, the leaf texture as well, even when they're not in flower and because of their leaf persistence. So we often use them in mass plantings up against buildings where you really want to break something up. Hydrangeas can be back of the border on larger hydrangeas. They can be front of the border on smaller hydrangeas. Many of the small varieties do quite well in containers. A little quick fire down there in a pot on the bottom left picture. The climbers need to be accounted for carefully before you put them in because they are very large, and because that tendency to root into things, you have to have a plan in place for handling them. They will root into stucco, certain types of masonry, as well as wood. You can get them to train out on a wire structure, but you have to physically train them to that wire structure typically. And that's a probably very common approach for the climbing hydrangeas, is to train them out on a frame so they don't root into something you don't want them rooting into. So one last case, I mentioned all the hydrangeas coming in, all hydrangea breeding, and all the new hydrangeas coming in. So new to me this year, as far as I know, new to this area for this year. This is a Macrophylla Strong Hearts Purple, a very bicolor with a spiraled inflorescence array, and typically about this raspberry tone or more purple, never lightening up past this. Strong bicolor on an extremely compact plant. Again, for our first year with it, they're saying 2 to 3 feet, excellent container specimen. So the story goes on. The hydrangeas are being bred as we speak, and there's a lot new stuff still to come. So that's what we had for a formal presentation. I would like to open up to any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much. Hang on. There I am. There I am. We only have a few questions, but do you want to mention your document, which we put in the chat?
Yes, thank you. I sent a Word document, and they've been kind enough to put that. Hope has been kind enough to put that in the chat for us. It's just a kind of a sampling list of the hydrangeas, about four pages of hydrangea varieties, descriptions, a lot of the ones we talked about, a few of the ones we didn't talk about, because an hour just really isn't enough time to cover hydrangeas. So yes, please feel free to access that and download that. And I wrote it up, so if you feel the desire to share it around, I have no objection to sharing it with anybody who has an interest.
Wonderful. Okay, let's jump into the questions. So Linda says that she would like to transplant an adult oak leaf to a sunnier spot. Do you have any advice on that?
Absolutely. Okay, so Linda, the neat thing about hydrangeas is the root systems are relatively fibrous for the size of plant they are, so they do transplant pretty well. Like any other shrub that you're transplanting, you want to do it when they are both as dormant as possible, but are also still likely to have potential to establish themselves in the new site before their stress periods. And with oak leaf hydrangeas, their stress period has nothing to do with cold. It's all about summer heat and drought. So your best time to do this is wait until they're fully colored over and as dormant as possible, which in the Pacific Northwest is probably right around Thanksgiving, late fall. Do dig up as much root system as you can handle. You're going to cut some, there's no way around it. And do a very light pruning to make sure you're not damaging. Now, moving a big hydrangea like that, hydrangeas are brittle. They're increasingly brittle when they're dormant, even more so than when they're growing. So you're going to have to handle it kind of gently. And I would recommend that you prepare a large sheet of weed barrier fabric. You do your pruning to get your root ball dug. You get your root ball dug, and you get 2 or 3 people to lift that hydrangea onto the weed barrier fabric and then use the weed barrier fabric to move it to its new location. Have the hole prepped to get it in right away. Give it a root stimulator or other shock reducer, vitamin B shock reducer, something like that, and let it root in. We're in the Pacific Northwest. Our winters are very mild. It will root all winter long. And so then you'll have a nice, well-rooted shrub going into the first heat stress of the summer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Shirley says she has a white mop head that grows on new wood. The plant is not dense and the flowers flop on long stems. How would you suggest the pruning should be done? And would you suggest supporting it in some way?
Okay, so Shirley, I would say, first of all, are we sure it is a true mophead macrophylla, or is it an arborescence? It's what you're describing is very typical of arborescence habits. They bloom early, they bloom on the new growth, and they're very floppy. And arborescence types, we definitely want to prune hard in the winter for a good reflush. If it is a macro, you don't want to prune quite as hard. And so typically what we'll do is we'll let them finish through the cycle as much as possible. As a batch of flowers finish out, and they'll color down, even the whites will color down to green or something like that as they begin to dry down. Go ahead and lower it down. So don't just take the spent flower out, but lower it down a foot or so and get some branch breakdown in there. But don't over prune. And if it's a true macrophylla, your best bet is to do most of your pruning as the new growth emerges in the spring. So we only prune them enough to maintain structural integrity and to thin out anything we need to, like interior wood that's too small dimension, too floppy. And then we wait until the buds actually start swelling on the stems. So this is February to March. And you'll start seeing those latent buds on the bare stems beginning to swell and beginning to pull away from the stem. And then you just come down to a pair of really, really rigid buds to develop the new growth. Floppiness in hydrangeas can be lack of thinning, where you're not taking enough older wood out that is getting kind of flimsy. Or where new growth that's coming out in the interior is not getting enough light and nutrients, so it stays flimsy. But it can also be from over pruning and making them push out too much new growth, trying to get to flower size. So it's more of a balancing. Can you support them? Absolutely. We have to do that all the time with hydrangeas. They tend towards a floppy behavior. If you put 3 or 4 stakes proportionally around the outer diameter, just inside the branch structure, and then you can use something like a green stretch tie or chain lock or anything that's not going to abrade too much on the stems. I hate using ropes or cordage because they typically abrade, but the grape tape stretch tie is great for this, but sometimes it isn't strong enough for hydrangea weight. So sometimes we need to go up to something a little stronger.
Wonderful. Okay, and Kevin says, can you speak to how to apply lime to encourage a pink color? Like how much to use and when to apply it?
So the problem with giving you volumetrics is it really depends on your soil and what your pH really is at. Generally, on a mature hydrangea, you're going to put a couple of handfuls of lime as the new growth emerges in the spring, and you may repeat that about bud formations, which would be about roughly 2 or 3 weeks ago. You start seeing the flower buds forming a lot of times on hydrangeas. Then monitor that first flower out. Are they pink? Are they muddy pink? Are they almost white and verging pink? That'll give you some direction to go. If they're fairly pink, maybe throw another handful or two on, but let be. If they're muddy, it's worse than pale. If they're muddy, it means you're throwing lime on something that's significantly acidic, and they've already started to develop acidic coloration, and now you're trying to correct them. So you need to put quite a bit more lime. If they're pale white but verging in towards pink, just a bit more lime will pink them up. The best way to do this really is as a granular lime. It can be either a calcium or magnesium lime, although I tend towards the magnesium limes, the dolomitic limes for this application. And you need to apply it kind of proportionally around the drip line, so just inside the outer edge of the shrub.
Okay, and Manu says, how can I help my climbing hydrangea, which is 10 years old and has never flowered?
I wish I had a perfect answer for you. First of all, avoid pruning. They are old wood bloomers, so if you are pruning to control the size and shape, you may be cutting a lot of the flower buds off. The Hydrangea peduliaris is a sparse and sporadic bloomer at best. They often do not bloom super well. If you're not pruning and you're not getting any flowers, try a zero nitrogen and moderate phosphorus and potassium fertilizer, 0-10-10 type fertilizer, to see if you can get some buds. The fertilizing should be done the year before for flower development. So it's something you would be feeding in June, July for next year's flower cycle, typically.
Wonderful. Well, Darren, that is all the questions that we have, and this has been very informative. And I've made my list of all the hydrangeas that I need to add to my garden.
Well,
So
stop by and see them. They're phenomenal at the nursery right now. They're
I,
just stunning.
I bet they are. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the recording and we're going to switch over to our chapter meeting portion.
Very good. Hope, thank you for hosting me and inviting me. Tara, thanks for technical support and getting those documents posted. I appreciate that. Love to do this again another time. Look forward to it. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thanks. Good night.